You know, I was asking Manoush earlier, like, what did, did you think about this in the privacy paradox project? Did you think about, like, what does it mean to listen to a podcast? But I actually don't know that I'd thought about it that much until I started working on that. There's been one company that actually now has a privacy policy for listeners on its website. But for the most part, like, I think, like, what happens when you have a podcast and you listen to a podcast? What data is collected? How is it used? What is done with that? I think that's something even a lot of people who, maybe not in this room, but a lot of people even who produce podcasts don't know about or think about. And so for this panel, we invited Wailin Wong to moderate. Wailin Wong is the host of Rework, which is a podcast from Basecamp, which is project management software. Although the company also makes other tools, I believe. Yeah. Yes, right. And Wailin was at the Chicago Tribune in its, she joined, she said, just after Sam Zell acquired the company. So, you know, Wailin is one of the many excellent, well-trained journalists who has been working in tech companies and doing really interesting work. And shortly after I came on this project, somebody shared a link to the episode she made with her CEO or president, CTO. And I actually, his name is Danish, and I'm gonna get it wrong unless I just use the initials, but they're DHH. And he, basically, he decided after a tweet from a listener concerned about privacy to switch podcast hosts. And Wailin interviewed DHH and then interviewed the old host and the new host. There's a link to this in the email you received. But anyway, I'm going to hand things over to Wailin to talk through this.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for sitting through the last panel before lunch. We'll all talk at 1.5 times speed to make this zippy and interesting. I'm going to start at the end with Andy and do intros, and then we will dive in. So to my far left, we have Andy Pellett, the co-founder of PodSights. To his right, we have Stacey Goers. She is the senior product manager for podcasts at NPR. And then to her right, we have David Adams, the VP of product at Megaphone. And to his right, we have Laurie Belleau. She is VP of Digital Innovation and the General Manager of the National Podcast Group at Market Enginuity. And then finally to my left, we have Chris Bavitz. He is the Managing Director of the Cyber Law Clinic at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. So thank you all for joining us. I think the previous panel did a really lovely job of setting up this kind of existential question we're all grappling with, which is like, we're at a crossroads. What choices do we make about our technological and privacy and kind of a capitalist future as an industry? And I wanted to kind of springboard off that and then dig into kind of exactly what happens now with data collection, kind of what happens along that chain as we get from creation to the listener, and kind of like what companies like sit along that chain and what are the things that they're working on in each of those steps. And so I wanted to start with Chris Bavitz to give us a little explainer on RSS, and I was wondering if you could just talk about its origins in the open web, and then talk about whether you agree with Marco's assessment from the earlier panel that it's like this thing that's working great and has worked great. Everything's great. Yeah.
That's great. I think I end up getting asked this question because if you Google RSS 2.0, you see that it sort of lives at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, where I'm based. But it's interesting. After I was asked to do the panel, I figured I should probably figure out what exactly it means that we are the maintainer and publisher of the standard. And as we talked about on the previous panel, the standard's been around for a while. I think it was sort of transferred to Berkman in 2003. And maintaining that standard doesn't require a lot. It means we just sort of put it out there on the web, which is, I think, both a good thing and a bad thing. It underscores that it sort of works, and it also underscores that not a lot has changed in the 17 years since we started hosting it and publishing it. So the other thing I'll say is that if anyone doesn't need an RSS explainer, it's probably this this room, so people here deal with it a lot more day to day than I do, but I'll just say really briefly that it's a specification that allows someone to provide for syndicated or serialized delivery of a piece of content. It's a bit of XML script that lives at a URL, and when you go to that URL, it points you toward a piece of content, and it includes a bunch of fields with respect to podcasts that includes things like the title, artwork, the category of the podcast, an indication of whether it includes explicit content, the language of the podcast, and that sort of thing. And the idea is, as we heard a lot on the previous panel, that this is a very different kind of model than exists certainly for any other kind of audiovisual content online. I think there are sort of two primary models we can talk about at a very high level. There is user-generated content sites where I come and I post my content to that site and it lives on their servers. There are sites that license in content, so that could be anything from a Netflix to a Spotify to an iTunes, and make it available either for streaming or downloads. Or you can have models that are premised on RSS that aggregate collections of these URLs and point to content that lives in a disaggregated way all over the web. And I think I generally do agree with Marco's pretty positive assessment of RSS, although I recognize that it creates complexity and challenges. I think for the most part, the quirkiness of the RSS ecosystem is feature, not bug. But we'll talk a lot about the implications in privacy on this panel. It also has implications in other areas where we are asking ourselves big questions today about what role we want intermediaries to play with respect to content that lives on their sites. So set aside privacy for a moment, think about content moderation. This is a really huge issue that's going on, and we actually addressed this in the program I work at Harvard with Jake Shapiro and others at Radio Public a couple of years ago. If you want to start asking that platforms take a more proactive role in getting rid of hate speech and harmful speech and that sort of thing, that means one thing when the content lives on their site. It may mean a very different thing when the aggregator is essentially just a collection of links.
Excellent, thank you. So then the RSS feed gets piped into hosting provider, and I got onto Blake's radar because we had left our old hosting provider in like a big fit of righteous indignation when Basecamp CTO learned that our old hosting provider was going to start doing targeted advertising. And we make a branded show, so we just run house ads for Basecamp, which funds the whole thing. So we don't actually take any outside advertising, and so this was not terribly relevant to us on a practical level, but our CTO was just mad about it enough that we left, I believe, like within the week. It was a directive to leave swiftly, and we did. And so I wanted to turn this over to David to talk about what happens at the hosting. At the hosting level, and talk about kind of what information you collect at your kind of step in the process.
Sure, yeah. I'd like to say a whole bunch, but it's really not a lot, right? That's part of the challenge that we have. And so Megaphone is the hosting end. We're the back end to the user getting their content. A listener has no idea what Megaphone is, and so we don't have that relationship. They have the relationship with the client that they're, whether it's a app or whether it's the web, they're pressing play, they're pressing download, and what they're expecting is for their audio file, their podcast to play, right? That's what they're expecting. And so in order for us to do that, we have to get very simple information, which is the IP address and the user agent, to really understand where we're delivering this file to. And along with that, that's been deemed now as being PII, and so that's we have to put safeguards in place where that is being deemed as. But the reality, what I think, I don't personally think that IP address is something that's PII. The way I look at this is, if I'm in Target and you see me shopping down the aisle for a broom, I'm in the market for a broom. I'm a white male, and I am in my 40s. That's all you know. You don't know my name. You don't know where I live. You might know that I live in the area that the Target's at, because why would I be there? And so we look at that and we say, okay, we have that IP address, we have the user agent, and we can use that for modeled targeting purposes. So we can understand demographically, are you male, are you female, with probability, right? Not absolute certainty. Are you interested in the market to buy a car, with probability? Are you in a location, geolocation, based on where you are? Are you in New York City? Are you in New Jersey? Are you in California? Without that IP level information, we don't know that at all, right? And there are some aspects to content delivery where we actually need to know your rights territory. We need to know, are you in the United States? Are you in somewhere outside? And without that information, we actually can't do our job on the Megaphone side. And so it's really important to have. It is deemed PII, so we respect that. And so what we did was we actually went through the really painful process of going through and being compliant. And I think we've had just over a dozen, maybe just under 20 requests to remove the data. And what we've seen so far, it's almost impossible to match a person's email address to their IP address to what they're submitting to us, so we can't identify who they are. But when we can tell you what shows you listened to, what ads you received, and that's pretty much it. There's really nothing else, from what we can determine from that factor. I wish there was a lot more. I wish there was listener data as to what cue points you get into, what are the areas where does someone press play, someone press pause. I wish there was just a lot more of that data, because there are things on that advertising side. So when I look at the ecosystem, I serve publishers, right, and I serve advertisers. And advertisers want an audience, and they want people, and they want a lot of people. But more than people, they want to know who those people are, right? They want to know the actual audience, what their demographics are. Having insights is a nice to have, it's a want. It's a real nice to have, especially if you're in automotive, and you actually want to buy, you want to be market for someone who's buying a car. You want to advertise to that, right? But if you're looking for an audience, it really comes down to an audience, and it comes down to, do I have a massive amount of people, and can I sell a razor to a bunch of women? I don't think I can. And that's the important part, right, is making sure that old adage, right? I know that 50% of my advertising is working. I just don't know which part is, which 50% is working. And so that's where the whole data side comes in. And there's really in the world of where we are, right, we're really inventing this technology and inventing the modeling around how to actually connect the dots, because the advertisers will spend money. And so there's direct response, and then there's branded advertiser, and then there's performance advertisers, right? There's things that are in the middle. And that's really important. They need to understand what that audience is. They need to understand what's my incremental reach. If they're spending $2 million on TV, if I spend another $150,000 in podcasting, am I reaching the same people, or am I not reaching the same people? And that's really important for them, right? That's really important for us to solve for as well, because the more $150,000 IOs come in, eventually you get to $1 million IOs, eventually you get to $5 million IOs, and then eventually you get to $10 million IOs, and then you get to that billion number in 2021, right? And that's where that's going to come from. It's going to come from that whole entire ecosystem. The more that we can give the trust to advertisers and trust to the consumers in both ways, that the listeners, that they know that their data is not being thrown out there in different purposes. For me, I actually like targeted ads. I like the ads that can come along. But as a platform, I support everything. If you want a model that is ad-free, by all means, we want you to have an ad-free model as well, right? And so that's really important for us too, is to make sure that if you want a subscriber base, to support a subscriber base as well. And so our job at Megaphone is to make sure that when someone presses play, download, stream, whatever the case is, that they actually get their file in the way that you intend it to be delivered to the user. Yep.
Great. And then before we get to Andy, because he's going to talk about prefixing, which is this kind of piece of technology that kind of sits in between, I wanted to throw it to Stacey, because David had mentioned the challenges in figuring out what people are doing or not doing as they listen to an episode. And I think at NPR, you've been working on something that addresses that, right? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, a lot of you here have already heard about a remote audio data, RAD, a framework that we've worked with a lot of folks in this room to have the conversations, and this was even about 3-ish years ago, looking at the space and recognizing that a download doesn't equal a listen. And for content creators and sponsors alike, like that can be kind of scary. You don't necessarily understand if your episode is effective, if folks are listening to the entirety of something. And we knew that while podcasting tech is fantastic and great, that there's space for improvement, there's space for innovations. And we started to talk through phone calls, through working groups, we met with some folks for a day-long session at NPR, and just like, how could we start to get at this in a way that was, most importantly, platform agnostic? What was really important to us at NPR and other publishers in the space was, it's fine and great if Apple gives us rich data, and fine and great if Spotify does and this and that, but when we start to think about who owns that and who owns that relationship with the listeners, it really needs to be backed by the publisher, and it needs to be something, whether it be the download data or something more rich that the publisher has, and the publisher has essential control over, and can compare things across the board and compare things very clear. So remote audio data is a framework, so it is not necessarily, it's not an SDK that everyone is like prefixing right now or anything to their feeds, but it is a way to be able to get in aggregate listening metrics on a piece of audio file by a publisher marking an audio file with specific cue points, and then the mobile apps recognizing this as a thing, and then sending, if a user has hit those cue points, sending that back to the hosting provider, the platform. So then in the same way that we're all looking at log files right now and parsing through download data and user agents, you'd be able to parse through to say, have 500 people hit cue point A, have 200 people hit cue point B. Okay, and you can start to deem the effectiveness of it. It's a very open standard in terms of, it's not saying that this is a set way of how you should be marking things, or this is, we're always gonna mark sponsors, or we're not. It's starting to look at when the industry needs something to go past downloads, because we're all feeling the pressure as is, all feeling the pressure of defining what is a listen, or what is a start, or what is a stream, that there is a tech framework that we as publishers agree on. Not perhaps everybody agrees with every ounce of it, but for the most part, we know that the foundation is there, and that we as an industry can then look to that and move to that and say, like, this is a pretty safe way to start to get to some of this information that we know is available, that can both benefit sponsors and that can also benefit our content creators in a way that respects users and puts a lot of the decisions on opt-in, opt-out in the hands of the developers, or the mobile app developers, or the websites, or wherever. It's something that sits outside of that. So that's RAD, or remote audio data, something that we've been working on, again, for a couple of years with a lot of folks here.
Excellent. And Andy, can you explain what PodSights does and how prefixing works?
Yeah, absolutely. Try to do the short version of this. So, the last panel talked a lot about how RSS has been the way that it's been for a long time now, and how that has sort of let this distributed ecosystem flourish, where you have, folks producing content, folks hosting content, and the apps that are letting people consume these things, which is really cool, because there's a lot of companies that can exist in this space. Because of that, you don't have this one sort of verticalized industry. One of the big tricks there is when advertisers come in and they want to spend money, they want to know if their money is actually giving them an ROI. Historically, as we talked about in the first panel, the way that people do this is promo codes or unique URLs. So everybody's heard the ad read where they say, please visit ziprecruiter.com/whatever. There are a number of problems with that, which people are aware of and have been okay with for a while. So getting to your actual question now, PodSights came in and we basically said, we can do a good version of this that fits within RSS as it is, based on IP addresses. So similar to the hosting provider, at a technical level, the way that this works is we insert an analytics prefix in the enclosure URL. So this is the actual URL to where the audio file lives. So we get the exact same data that the hosting provider gets. That is the IP address and user agent of the person downloading the podcast. So we get that in our integration with the hosting provider, and then we also have an integration with the brand where we have what's commonly referred to as a pixel, which is basically a small piece of JavaScript code that lives on their site. And that gives us the same IP and user agent data on that brand website. And so our job on the back end is to basically take all that data, again, like the IP-based data from the hosting provider and also from the brand website, and then mix those together and figure out, instead of depending on somebody putting in a promo code, did the person that downloaded this podcast also visit this brand website or make a purchase from there?
Okay, so you match it up, and then so if the listener goes to the website and they're shopping around, you're able to see they put this in their cart, they remove this from their cart, they are maybe looking to spend this much, or they left without making a purchase. I mean, that's what pixels can also do, right?
Yeah, so it's important to be a little bit careful about the distinction between a pixel lets you know everything about what somebody does versus, we give the brand the ability to send us certain things. So this will be like, did this person show up on the page, yes or no? did they actually make a purchase, yes or no? But it's not to the level of, knowing anything about the person. We don't get like details about a person. So it's only the specific data that the brand website sends to us. It's not everything.
So the brand could be collecting more than they are sending back
Absolutely.
to you. Okay. Can you, and David, feel free to jump in here too. Can you talk about integration with third-party databases? Because I feel like this is kind of where the sorcery happens. That is like fairly opaque, at least, I mean, to me, maybe to some others in the room, about like how we begin to get more information about what listeners are doing beyond IP address and user agent, and maybe, whether or not they visit this like binary of like, did they visit the site or not? How do you get kind of into more intelligence?
So the basic thing that we do is basically we work with what's called a cross-device graph company. So there are a number of companies out there that basically aggregate data from large consumer websites, and they get an idea of, does this household have like 2 iPhones and a MacBook and a desktop computer? So you see this used a lot for things like fraud prevention, where websites will be like, you're coming from a new IP that we haven't seen before. So we basically leverage that same technology so that we can get an idea of, if you listen to a podcast on your phone at your house and then you, buy a mattress on your desktop computer, we have some idea, again, probabilistic, as to whether that might be the same person.
Yeah, and what we do is we facilitate that relationship. And so within the hosting platform, we apply the tags so that the tags can be part of that campaign. And so on a campaign end, so he's speaking about a specific campaign, if there's a mattress company out there or a Best Buy, for example, and they're looking at buying TVs and they want to know, did someone hear the TV ad and then go to the TV section? And so what we do is facilitate that pixel being part of our platform so that it fires when that is downloaded. It fires along with it. We send them the data, or any third party that we work with, we send them the data, and then they can do their match on their end. And so once we send that off to them, it's up to that third party to then figure out what that match is.
Laurie, can you talk about this white paper that Market Enginuity did with Claritas? Because that was about kind of what are we able to learn about listeners, right? Can you explain kind of what that project was?
Yeah, I think I can talk to it a little bit, although I'm not going to get into methodology. I see my friend Matt over there from Claritas. But I guess 2 things, and I would start with, it came up earlier, and Sarah was talking about it. We want to grow this space, right? So I, too, have an ad fantasy. and my ad fantasy is I want to be in that place where I can protect the privacy of the consumers, of the listeners, and I also have an obligation to deliver from the marketing perspective, right? So we've been talking a lot about the front end of that coin is what does the audience look like? What are those attributes? We've actually done 2 white papers, one in October, which was really designed to create an audience profile of the PRX podcast listener. So, and there was a data append, right? We overlaid some psychographic information, behavioral information, but basically it just proved out what I think we all believe, and that's the quality of this audience, right? High household income, highly educated. Another item that surfaced for us was, too, that this is an audience that can be really hard to reach across more traditional medium, right? They're not consistently engaging with the specific digital platforms. So, so we learned that. I think the other part of that was the second white paper, which was just this month, which just really talked about attribution in much broader terms, right? Because the other side of that coin from the marketer's perspective is we do need to demonstrate performance. We do need to prove out the effectiveness. I think I consider myself an old timer in this campaign like Sarah. Sorry, I'm having allergies. And we've all been talking about, but how do we get more money into the space? How do we get more of these people on board? And those brand advertisers are just not going to release those big budgets with no proof of performance. So we have to be able to talk to, can we deliver the audience, the target audience for a campaign? Yes, we can do that. And then on the back end, did it work? Did it make a difference? Was there incremental lift? We do need to be able to do that. So my fantasy is, and hopefully with this group is, I think we do have to get to that place. Where is the middle ground where we can do both? Mm-hmm. Because I want to be part of supporting great content. I do. I take that very seriously. And I want to be able to do that for those content creators and like I said, deliver on the marketer's expectation. for me personally, just digging into this privacy issue, there's a lot that's very scary when you talk about the surveillance data. Makes me realize that I have serious trust issues. And I think I'll just save that conversation for BetterHelp. But, you know, that's the space we occupy right now. So my hope is that we work together so that we can have that framework.
What are advertisers and brands asking for? Like, what are you hearing from them? And I think David could probably speak to this too. Like, when they're like, are they just saying like, we want to reach, you know, people with iPhones in Montana? Or are they like, it'd be nice to have, we're talking about nice to have, it would be nice to have, you know, be able to target to 40-year-old women who drive like Subarus. You know what I mean? Like, what are you hearing in terms of like requests from like how granular they want to get?
Yeah. So it's all of the above. I mean, it gets really granular, but it starts at the top where it's they just want to understand the audience, the core demographics. Usually, it's aligned with digital TV side as well. So male, female, and then age bands. That's where it starts, and then you can start to layer in: is there psychographic information? Where are they interested or in the market to buy things? Or you know, are there other traits of types of people that would be interested in buying their product? So as far as reaching that audience, they care mostly about the audience that they're reaching. So in the razor example, they want to make sure they're hitting a bunch of men rather than a bunch of women, right? Because that's who's going to buy the razor, unless your wife does your shopping for you. And so there's that market too. But then there's the world where we're starting to get a lot of requests for, is someone listening to my podcast, and someone listening to the actual ad, and when this comes about is when you start to think about programmatic, and the challenges with programmatic. Programmatic is entirely performance based. They run algorithms based on whether or not this ad is working, not working, and they move their dollars to where it's going to go. And when the ad can't be listened to or proved to be listened to, they shy away from it. And so programmatic's been really, really slow on the download side. Streaming side, it's a little bit of movement there, but on the download side, really, really slow. And that's one of the barriers to it. And as you move more towards digital, and as you went from display, which was entirely pretty much all programmatic, where video is going programmatic, audio is soon to also follow suit, because that's essentially what happens. The digital buyers, because now the digital folks want to treat this inventory the same way that they're treating their digital inventory, and so they want to align it the same way. And so that's the types of asks that we're getting at. We're getting asked, how do we actually quantify that someone listened to it? What's the audience that they went to? And then how do you actually prove that my advertising is actually working?
And I think I would add too, how to optimize, right? So if someone is investing in a campaign, are we paying attention so that we can shift dollars, that we can make the changes we need to make sure they get the return they're looking for? So.
Yeah.
I was thinking about something that came up in the previous panel that Marco was saying about how there's this incredible long tail of shows out there. There's like shows catering to like every last subculture and interesting niche, which I think is like one of like the really great things about shows. And it seems like if you wanted to find, you know, men and not women to sell razors to, or you had a product that would like appeal to a certain kind of person, you're like, well, I want to find the person who's most likely to buy this product. It seems like you could just like look at this wide array of shows out there, and you're like, oh, well, what kind of like subculture, what kind of like type of person who listens to like a Dungeons and Dragons podcast, or, you know, like a beauty podcast or a natural beauty podcast, you know, would be interested in purchasing ABC product. And is that like not something, is that not generating like enough revenue? Is it too difficult to go and find which shows are out there in these like very niche categories and then try to like match them with advertisers? Is it because it's like, it's just too vast and sprawling? Like, what are the challenges there? Because it seems like if you wanted to get like super targeted, like who wants to buy like this cruelty-free mascara, like you could just like look up like where all like the natural beauty podcasts are and then like advertise on them. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And if you're going direct with the brand on the show side, you can find those. And if the audience is there, that's the problem, right? Is the vast amount of audience there that's going to reach their budget? Or are you going to hit a $10,000 budget, $5,000 budget, $3,000 budget, or $100,000 to anyway to $1 million, right? And so I think that's where those direct relationships come in, and they work really, really well. When you actually have a podcast that is really niche to a particular environment and you know your audience, you can have that direct relationship with that brand and that advertiser, and that's really healthy, right? And if we can keep supporting that in the ecosystem, because we all said it, it's a very intimate relationship when you're doing a podcast, right? It's in your ears. You're between the ears. You're not doing much else. You're commuting. You're traveling. Your cognitive brain is really not doing anything else other than listening. And it's proven that if you start doing email, you start watching TV, or you start looking at your phone, you really don't know what's going on. You kind of have to go back. And so that's where that value comes in, so that you can, if you have a niche product, to go with that, and that's there. The brand side, when you start getting to the P&Gs of the world and you start getting to the the Verizons of the world, they really want to reach tonnage. And that does become a problem. And so then you have to have some sort of an aggregator to aggregate along with that, right? And so one thing at Megaphone, what we do is we actually have that ability to be able to put you part of the Megaphone targeted marketplace, because you may have a smaller show that can't reach an actual brand, or the brand's not interested in purchasing your inventory because it's not there. What we do is we aggregate that, and we can identify, because you're part of that audience and because you're part of the demo model we do, that you are a male or a female and within an age brand, and so that you can supplement your income that way. And so that is certainly something that as part of our platform, we do enable that. We do provide for that.
And Stacey, can you talk about, when we talk about not the long tail, but kind of like big shows that have like mass appeal? NPR obviously fits that category. It's not a niche, player by any stretch of the imagination. And can you talk about maybe the limitations of the host-read ad and why new ad formats need new ad tech from your perspective?
Yeah, one of the arguments that does frustrate me is when we talk about the good old days of podcasting with host-read ads and how we want to harken back to that. And that doesn't work for everybody, and it doesn't work for public radio. If you can think about having, for example, like the host of Up First read some of the ads that come after, that doesn't work with our editorial practices. And in the same way, you're not able then to put products out. I always think of our fantastic podcast, Believed, which was a really hard subject. And if we didn't have a diverse ad network within just NPR itself and the ability to sell things across shows or at a portfolio scale instead of a specific host read, the figuring out how to put a great product out there like that on a really hard subject that gets a lot of brands a little more squirmish, and I respect that. And so from our end, to have a diversity of ad products that has space for host read, as someone who's bought products from host read ads, like I respect that. But then also having the technology that allows you to do things, like when I think of the NPR ad model, we have something baked in to, use the language we all know, for a period of time, and then we can bring something dynamic after a period of time. And that allows us to work with different sponsors and at different price points. And then even that same technology, which I think is oftentimes something that's lost, is that it allows us to experiment with cross-promotion optimization. We don't want to have a campaign to donate for an end-of-year campaign running in a podcast in March. If we can use some of these same technologies to be able to use the things that we all talk about, bartering cross-promo trades across shows, in a thoughtful way, and be able to sunset things when they're no longer timely and bring them in when they are, like that's something to champion in the industry and not necessarily something to be scared about. So when I think about having diverse ad models and like the structure to enable us to do that, like those are the different pathways that I think about.
I wanted to switch gears slightly and maybe talk about what you all think are good practices for transparency and for offering ways to opt in or out, and kind of what you see currently and maybe what would be nice to have, as we're talking about nice to haves. Chris, do you want to start, and then anyone else should feel free to jump in?
Sure. So I think that there are a couple of layers to that. The first is a legal compliance layer, which is everyone needs to be talking to their attorneys about what is the bare minimum one has to do to comply, particularly as we've been talking about in this panel and the previous panel with the GDPR, which affects Europe and the European Economic Area, and CCPA, which is now coming online this year, which relates to folks in California. And those laws generally, we're not going to go deep on either of them, but provide some restrictions on the ways in which information can be gathered, what can be done with information once it's been gathered, and provide often for an opportunity for individuals, as Dave was saying, to pull information out if they don't want their information being used. So there's a legal compliance layer to start with. I think above and beyond that, and actually I think inherent in those laws as well, there's a sense that individuals need to have an opportunity to understand the nature of the bargain that they're making when they agree to consume a product for free in exchange for giving up their data. So I often think about this: if I make a decision that I want to post pics of my kids on Facebook, I'm implicitly, I guess, when I'm doing that, making some value judgment that there is a positive that comes from that. My friends I haven't seen in a long time get to see my kids, and there is potentially some harm, but that benefit outweighs the harm in that particular case. I don't know that that's true. I think about this stuff all day long, and I don't think of myself as equipped to actually make that value judgment with respect to Facebook or most social media platforms. And so this kind of gets to your question, how do we do that? I think a lot of it has to do with privacy practices around disclosures online, text-based disclosures, privacy policies, visual, graphical privacy policies, pre-roll information on the actual audio product that explains the way data is going to be used and what's being done with it. Moving as much as possible toward opt-in models, which I appreciate there are really significant challenges given the way the RSS ecosystem works, but opt-in meaning that I affirmatively tell either the platform or the creator of the podcast that I'm okay with my data being used in a certain way, rather than coming all along later and opting out. Again, I recognize that there are a lot of technical challenges there, but I also think there's a big component to this that is about education more broadly. Not sort of pull us out of the technical details, but a lot of this has to do with, again, getting people to understand the nature of those value exchanges that I admitted I don't understand that well when I choose whether to upload a particular photo on social media. So that's a start. But.
I would just say that's a great answer. No, I think making the privacy, your ability to opt in, opt out, to understand how your data is being used is critical. I also think there's a role that these technology platforms and solutions providers can play in working with the content creators, with the sales teams, to find the middle ground, right? To find those solutions, to be more transparent. As we read these agreements, right, and we enter into this, to really pull that privacy piece up to the front, and maybe it can't work exactly the way it was originally designed, but to partner to find that right solution, I think that would be awesome.
Yeah, no, I echo the same thing Chris and Laurie said over here. The one thing that's challenging is there's this whole world of you have the ad model where you have the explicit approval where you can go to ad choices, and it's a little triangle, and most people in this room may know what it is. Anybody outside this room that's not in advertising has no clue what it is. You'll see it everywhere, and that's really it's the way to opt out. And I don't know that everybody knows that they know how to opt out. And what they do know is that all this data is being collected on them. And there's some way, somehow, they're getting an ad and they're saying, oh my God, what's going on? And they're hitting the person who they think owns that content to say, oh my God, this is what's going on. And so, I think what's really important is, as long as we have those processes in place and there's a way to facilitate the requests that they're doing, it's great, right? And that's really the compliance we have to be. So as part of the platform, we do want to be able to provide that verbiage that you can put as part of your notes, but then not every app supports that. And so it becomes really challenging. And so we do on our side, on our privacy policy and Megaphone side, you can come to Megaphone, read it, you can opt out, you can do all these things, but like I opened with, we don't have the relationship with the listener, and so they don't generally know who we are. And so when you guys, publisher partners, when you get those requests, we're here to help you and figure out and navigate through that.
Can I ask, what does opting out, if I went to Megaphone and opted out, like what does that, what happens?
Yeah. So for CCPA, we will take your IP address and user agent, and we'll disclose what information we have about you, which is generally, if we can find it, it's generally what ads you've listened to, your geographical location, shows that you listen to. And then if you say do not track or do not sell my data, we then put a process in place where it's removed. And so anytime we see that request, it just doesn't follow through.
And Stacey, I'll give you the last word because I think we only have a few minutes left. I wanted to ask Andy about disclosure prefixing because Captivate, this company that Blake had referenced earlier on the privacy policy, it says that its recommendation is that publications like disclose what prefixing services are in use, like right in the show notes, like on an episode to episode level. Is that something that you would want to see, or like would that make your life very difficult, or like what would that look like?
Yeah, 100% for it. I mean, this is a great example of something where RSS being the way that it is, it makes it, in a way, there's not really a mechanism to do it technically, right? So on the web, in the browser, you have JavaScript, you can actually bring up, so for instance, we're talking about GDPR. Like when GDPR came out, all of a sudden every website you go to has a pop-up at the top or the bottom that says, do you accept cookies to use this site? I think some people would argue that that is just kind of a dance. It doesn't really mean anything. A lot of websites, you can continue to use them without clicking that button. And I would argue personally that 90% of the people that click that button have no idea what it means. They just want to use the website, right? So, okay, quick show of hands. Who wants to see that in podcasting, where every time you listen to a show, there's a pop-up in your podcast app that says, do you accept third-party analytics prefix? Show of hands. I know somebody wants it.
I mean, I probably will.
Anyways, to that point, yeah, right. So it's an open question. But to that point, like if you look at legislation, especially like CCPA, which is very broad, and think about how that affects podcasting, especially in explicitly calling out IP addresses as personally identifiable information, it puts not just my company, but everybody in this room in a tough spot. And so, yeah, absolutely. Like, you know, we have opt-outs as well, and we're happy to stop doing attribution for folks that opt out. But like the education piece is kind of intractable. Like, how do you tell people all this stuff? And I think that's an open question. And I think it's a huge conversation to have. Maybe there are some folks in the room that have the right context to talk about that. But at this point, podcasting as an industry, like, we don't have a seat at the table, and we can just do the best that we can. And if that's, you know, appending something to the show notes, then okay, we'll see what happens.
Start from there.
Yeah.
How does opting out work at PodSights?
Yeah, so that's actually a really tricky thing too that I think Dave touched on earlier, is like when somebody opts out, the PII is an IP address. So we work with our partners, they send things basically upstream to us. So we'll get an IP address. But we can't just opt out that IP address, because for us, we have to verify that the person opting out from that actually has the rights to opt out from that IP address, right? You can't just go and send us every IP address and then we stop doing attribution for all of those. So to your question, if we can verify that it's a legitimate request, then we will no longer perform attribution for anything coming from that IP address. But figuring out if it's a legitimate request is a difficult problem.
Yeah, for example, like we receive requests where it's just out in the open through data. We can't reconcile that IP address because it's a public IP address, and so when we go back, we have to have a communication with the submitter to find out, can you give us more information about who you are? And so that's where we do that validation as well. It's not, by any means, it's not a automatic process. It is a manual process at the moment.
It's a mess. And if you look at larger companies on the web that have, you know, like trust and safety divisions that do this, and will, like, depending on the company you talk to, they'll ask you to send them like a photocopy of your driver's license. Like, we don't want to go there. We don't want to deal with that. We
get more PII.
Right. I mean, again, like somebody talked about, so if you look at where podcasting is and it has been, and you compare that to something in digital like Facebook or Google, we're starting from the bottom where we don't have all that data. We have very, very basic data about who you are. And honestly, from like a privacy standpoint, I think you would be much happier as a consumer of podcasting than you would as any sort of other platform. So I guess last point here is I would love it if there was more nuance in the discussion about what information people are tracking about you, because I think a lot of people look at that as a boogeyman of like Cambridge Analytica, and they know everything, they know my credit score, they know where I live, and that is not the case in podcasting.
And Stacey,
Not yet.
And Stacey, can you talk about, I mean, trust is like the central core currency of what NPR has and does and functions on. Can you talk about kind of what you think is kind of like the best practices around transparency as we like move into this uncertain future?
Yeah, and that's why I'm actually really excited for this afternoon, because with having our breakout sessions and talking, so, you know, we have some examples like Captivate, and Mark's team there is like a wonderful way of like showing and displaying that, but we actually don't have like a great inventory or great user testing around like, and please tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't know of a company who has done like end-to-end user testing of, do you like our privacy policy and does it make sense? Like I would love to see that. And I would love to understand so that then all of our teams like don't have a massive development team to be able to spend oodles of time trying to figure out the most perfect thing. What works and what's effective? And then we can put it within our products in a thoughtful way. So I would hope we can brainstorm this afternoon and start to get to some of that, because I think really if we understand that, then we can get the best practices that we know resonates with our users.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us, and time for lunch.